Welcome to Subclass School, the series where I break down everything there is to know about every subclass. In today's lesson, we will be covering the solar subclass, specifically the verbs. There are 6 subclass verbs associated with the solar subclass, one of these being an elemental pickup. If you know all 6, then pause the video and comment them down below and I will like your comment. And remember, no cheating. So the 6 solar subclass verbs are Scorch, Ignition, Restoration, Radiant, Cure, and Firesprite. The first 5 are elemental effects, and the Firesprite is the elemental pickup. So we'll start at the top with Scorch. Bungie's in-game description for Scorch is the target is singed by destructive solar light, taking damage over time. Scorch damage increases as the target accumulates more Scorch stacks. After enough Scorch stacks are applied to the target, they ignite. So what the heck does this mean? Well, luckily for us, we have a weapon in the Skyburner's Oath that applies Scorch. And the fine folks at the Destiny Data Compendium have the info on just how much. So real quick, I have a link to the Destiny Data Compendium in the description. It is the single greatest resource of Destiny information that exists. Shout out to the amazing folks who compile the data for that spreadsheet. While I do a lot of the testing myself, I also utilize that document extensively. So the compendium states that Skyburner's Oath applies 5 plus 5 Scorch. And just to note, these have to be hipfire bullets. When you ADS, it doesn't shoot the slugs that apply Scorch. So what this means is that each bullet applies 5 stacks of Scorch. And if you have the fragment Ember of Ashes on, you will apply an additional 5 Scorch for every shot. So 10 Scorch total. So that is how the compendium descriptions work when you see the plus sign. That refers to Ember of Ashes being equipped. So as we stack Scorch, the Scorch deals more and more damage the more Scorch stacks you apply. Pretty awesome, right? But you can only apply so much Scorch. After 100 stacks of Scorch are applied, you will cause an ignition, something that we will get to a little bit later. But when an ignition occurs, this causes a big AoE explosion that deals a good chunk of damage. And upon ignition, all the Scorch stacks are removed, so you no longer get that damage over time from the Scorch, but you do get a big boom. There is then a small cooldown of 1.6 seconds before you can start stacking Scorch on the target again. Make sense? Good. On screen now are all the damage numbers, but I will try to make sense of it in my own words. First, the text in red means PvP application. So Scorch cannot kill a player in PvP. It can take them down to 1 health, but it will not down them. As you can see, Scorch lingers a lot less in PvP, which is good because damage over time effects in PvP are quite annoying. In PvE, however, the Scorch lasts longer. It lingers for 4.5 seconds, and then it decreases by 5.67 stacks every 0.56 seconds. So say you stack an enemy up to 90 stacks of Scorch, but for some reason you don't want it ignition, it will linger for 4.5 seconds, and then decrease by 5 2/3 every half a second roughly. But you can reapply the Scorch, which has a 1.4 second delay. So say it fell down to 50, then you could reapply it and get the Scorch stacks back up to 100 and cause an ignition. And it would take fewer total shots with Skyburners because some Scorch is still applied. Also, once you apply 60 Scorch stacks, you get yellow numbers on the enemy. So I made a visual representation to help you out. These are the base damage values of Scorch, and we will get to how we can stack these in a minute. But basically, here are the lowest numbers of Scorch you can apply. This was applied by hipfiring Skyburner's Oath with no Ember of Ashes, no solo operative, or any artifact mods. I took them off for the testing. No buffs or debuffs, just base Scorch damage. But there are also ways we can increase Scorch damage. It stacks based off the initial application of the Scorch. So if you apply Scorch with Skyburner's Oath, then your Scorch damage will be affected by things like Radiant and Weapon Surges. Essentially buffs that are weapon based. On my base max Scorch damage at 95 stacks, we had 1659 damage per tick. But with Radiant and 3 Solar Weapon Surges, it is 2531. This is 52.5% more damage, which makes sense, because Radiant gives 25% and 3 Solar Surges gives 22%, and 1.22 times 1.25 is 1.525 or 52.5%. And then ability application works the same way. If an ability is buffed, then that buff damage will apply to the Scorch, so long as it was the ability that was the initial applicator of the Scorch. What I mean is this. If you shot the enemy with Skyburner's Oath first, then did a charged melee, you wouldn't get the extra Scorch damage from buffed melee, say something like Winter's Guile. But as long as the melee was the first to apply the Scorch, then you will get the buff here. In the background gameplay, we can see what a difference it makes on something like Winter's Guile. I should note that in this clip, I forgot to take Solo Operative and Ember of Ashes off, but both comparison clips had them, so it just cancels out. I just wanted to point that out. Anyways, at base, our Scorch hits for 925 damage, but then we get 5 stacks of Winter's Guile, which is a 3.75 times damage buff, and our Scorch hits for 3469 damage. And again, if we take 925 and multiply that by 3.75, we get 3469. So once again, the math checks out. This also applies to ignitions, which we will talk about very soon. Another thing I did not mention is that only one player can apply Scorch and receive the damage for it. Here's a clip where my friend shot Carl and then I shoot Carl and don't get any Scorch ticks because they applied the initial Scorch. We then swap roles and I apply the initial Scorch and they shoot and I get the Scorch ticks. This is why things like Dragon's Breath are only good for one person to use. I ran a Warlord's Ruin with my buddies and me and another guy had the same damage. However, he was using Tommy's matchbook and I had Dragon's Breath and Sunbracers. But it is because he was getting all the Scorch and Ignition damage applied to his damage because he applied the initial Scorch. So while you and your teammates' Scorch counts for stacking up Scorch to cause Ignitions and higher Scorch stacks, like you can see in the footage, only one person gets the benefit of that damage. I'm not shooting, but he is, and the Scorch ticks are going up, but I am the only one getting the damage ticks. Also, Scorch does more damage the higher you have stacked, as I have shown, but I wanted to emphasize this point, because this is a pretty common misconception with Ember of Ashes. It does not increase your Scorch damage, but rather it increases your stacks of Scorch. Therefore you get more stacks quicker, which results in higher Scorch damage. I hope that makes sense. But something like Dawn Chorus, this buffs all of your Scorch damage by 200% or 3 times more damage. So that is why it is so freaking good this season. Another thing I didn't mention is the weapon perk Incandescent. This spreads Scorch to enemies on kill. The enhanced form of the perk will add an additional 5 Scorch if you have Ember of Ashes equipped. So it is 30 Scorch at base and 40 with Ember of Ashes. And with Ashes and enhanced Incandescent, it is 45 stacks of Scorch. So if you kill a few adds that are grouped together with an incandescent weapon, then you can proc an Ignition. The machine gun from Duality Fixed Odds is absolutely great for this. So let's recap Scorch. Scorch is a damage over time effect. It stacks up to 100 stacks on an enemy, at which point it causes an ignition. When the ignition occurs, all Scorch stacks are removed. If a weapon applies the Scorch, then the Scorch damage can scale with things like Radiant and Weapon Surges. Basically, anything that buffs your weapons should theoretically also buff your Scorch damage. So even though I didn't test it, things like Weapons of Light or Blessing of the Sky from Lumina should still buff your Scorch damage. And the same goes for abilities. If an ability caused the Scorch will scale with the ability's buffs. So if a Verity's Brow buffed Grenade or a Winter's Guile buffed Melee applies the initial Scorch, then your Scorch will receive the bonus damage for as long as you have the damage bonus up. So for Winter's Guile, the damage bonus is only 5 seconds long, so this can be tough to maintain. And that is basically everything you need to know about Scorch. Woof, that first verb was a long one. But don't worry, the others are much simpler. This is probably the most complex verb of all the subclasses. There's just a lot going on with it. So I mentioned that Scorch stacks up to 100 and then causes an ignition. Bungie defines ignitions as a large solar explosion which deals damage in an area around the target and stuns unstoppable champions. So again, you have probably seen this a lot this season, especially with Polaris Lance. Thanks to Ember of Ashes, Kindling Trigger, and the Perfect Fifth, you can proc ignitions easier than ever this season. That is because with the bonus Scorch from Ember of Ashes, Kindling Trigger applies 45 stacks of Scorch when you are Radiant, and Polaris Lance's Perfect Fifth Shot applies 60 Scorch, for 105 total. So you can just go around and click click boom on everything. There are fragments that can further enhance your ignitions like Ember of Char and Ember of Eruption, but we'll cover that in the fragments lesson. The description from the Destiny Data Compendium is on screen now. As I said, it's quite a bit simpler than Scorch. It says ignitions have about a 10 meter radius, so they can deal some pretty good AoE damage, as is evidenced in some of the Battleground GMs this season. And as I mentioned with Scorch, the ignition damage also scales based on application. So here is a base ignition from Skyburners hitting for 46,989 damage. And then we have 3 Solar Surges and Radiant, so a 52.5% damage buff. And what do you know, we hit for 52.5% more damage at 71,658. Same goes for ability application. A base Incinerator Snap hits for 49,125 damage from the ignition, And then a fully buffed Winter's Guile melee hits for 184,217 damage, which is 49,125 times 3.75. So once again, the math checks out. And that pretty much covers ignitions. And once again, I just want to reiterate that after an ignition, all Scorch stacks are removed and you will have to stack Scorch up again from 0 to proc another ignition. So next we have Radiant, and it may seem as simple as, oh, it's a 25% damage buff. But this is subclass school, so I'm going to teach you as many intricacies as I know, because there are some things that you absolutely have to be aware of. But first, let's talk about its main feature, which is that it gives a 25% damage bonus to your weapons. This is a pretty significant damage bonus given it is pretty easy to proc on a solar subclass and to keep it proc thanks to fragments like Ember of Torches and Ember of Empyrean. In PvP, Radiant isn't as strong however, it only applies a 10% buff. You can see my sniper shot hits for 136 without Radiant and 149 with it. There may be some rounding errors, but it's basically 10% bonus. Radiant also gives your weapons anti-barrier capabilities. However, there are some caveats with that. If a weapon already has an anti-champion mod on it, such as Overload Auto Rifle, then it will not be able to pierce a barrier shield. But if you take that mod off, then it would be able to. Anytime you have this anti-barrier capability, you can shoot through things like Taken Vandal Bubbles, Hobgoblin Immunity, the shields that Hive Knights put up, etc. So this can be very handy in general gameplay and not just as a means to deal with barrier champions. And one other thing I want to note is it will also not allow things like Chill Clip to slow and stun an Overload champion. So normally, slow will stun an Overload. But if you have Radiant, then it is acting like an anti-barrier weapon. And this means that your slow all of a sudden can't stun an Overload. It's a niche scenario, but definitely something you want to be aware of. Another thing you should know about Radiant is its interaction with Golden Gun. You can buff your Golden Gun shot by 25% by having Radiant procced. Another key interaction that you should know about is how Well of Radiance overrides Radiant, as strange as that sounds. I have two clips to prove this. First, you can see damage comparisons with no Radiant on a Golden Gun and a Goldie in a Well. The reason they aren't identical is I accidentally had Heart of the Flame from the artifact on, so it buffed my Goldie slightly when I was shooting it from the Well of Radiance because my teammate was beside me. But essentially what this means is do not shoot your Goldie while standing in a Well of Radiance. You will not get the 25% damage buff. Even if you proc Radiant for yourself, it will be overridden by the Well. The next clip that illustrates this is Kindling Trigger not applying Scorch when you are in a Well. I have Radiant and I shoot my Scout Rifle and you can see it applies Scorch to the enemies. I then pop my Well and shoot them and no Scorch is getting applied, meaning we don't actually have Radiant active. Hopefully Bungie changes this interaction between Radiant and Well of Radiance in Final Shape, because it is quite annoying and slightly ironic that a Well of Radiance doesn't actually make you Radiant. And those are pretty much all the unique interactions with Radiant that I think are relevant to today's lesson. Next up, we have Restoration. To be quite honest, this may be the most broken verb in the whole game. Bungie describes it as so. You regenerate health and shields over time. Cannot be interrupted by taking damage. So when I started my channel back in Beyond Light, one of my favorite things to do was run solo Lost Sectors. I love challenging myself to get quick times. Well, this season, I ran all the Lost Sectors again, and Restoration basically takes all the challenge out of it. Normally in Destiny, you have to wait to regen your health, and if you take any damage, then your health regen will be interrupted. This forces you to slow down and play cover. With Restoration, in pretty much any content outside of Grandmasters, you can just out-heal the damage. It's busted. And it was even hit with a nerf this season, and it's still insanely strong. I abused it to solo flawless every dungeon this season, as well as do a bunch of Master Lost Sectors in under 3 minutes. Seriously, it's crazy. The Destiny Data Compendium states you get 35 HP per second for Resto times 1 and 50 HP per second for times 2. And these were also the values Bungie gave in the Season of the Wish patch notes when it got nerfed. So it isn't quite as OP as it used to be, but it's still extremely powerful. Again, in anything under GM content, you pretty much just out-heal everything. Unless there are a ton of ads shooting you in Master content or something. You can see in a regular Lost Sector that my health barely comes off from full. And in PvP, the restoration values are cut in half, so not as strong, but still pretty good. Speaking of healing, the next verb we have is Cure. Bungie describes it as so. You are healed in a burst of mending light. This instantly gives us 60 HP per stack of Cure. In the background gameplay, you can see examples of cure times 1, times 2, and times 3, and you can see the amount of health that I'm getting back. So cure times 2 is 120 HP, and times 3 is 180 HP, which is almost full health. Healing grenades give 1 stack of cure as well as proc restoration. And with Touch of Flame, they will give resto times 2. Phoenix Dive gives cure times 2, and proccing Heat Rises by consuming a grenade gives cure times 3, and it can be any grenade, not just healing grenades. I'm not going to go much deeper than that, as I will cover it more in the Subclass School video for solar aspects. But yeah, basically, cure is just a burst of healing. And the weapon perk heal clip also procs 1 stack of cure when you reload after a kill. And finally, that brings us to the final solar verb, which is Firesprite. Bungie defines this as a luminous concentration of solar energy. When picked up, Firesprites grant grenade energy. The Destiny Data Compendium says this is a 12.5% bump to our grenade energy on pickup. And these are not created for allies, only ourselves. I tested it and they do in fact last for 25 seconds before disappearing. And they have a 5-second cooldown between spawns, which is probably good, because you could Scorch and kill a ton of enemies and you would just have Firesprites everywhere. And at 12.5% grenade energy back on pickup, you'd basically have unlimited grenades. As far as elemental pickups go, these ones are definitely quite strong. And that concludes our deep dive into the solar verbs. I hope this was informative for you, and if it was, a like would be greatly appreciated. And if you want to watch the other deep dive videos coming soon, then make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson on solar fragments. Take care.